Good evening. Welcome to Triton College's virtual lecture recital series. My name is Salvatore Siriano. I'm the lead music instructor at Triton College. Thank you for joining us this evening. I want to let everyone know we are recording this event. This is a webinar, so your video will always be off. If you have any questions for Crystal Cortez, you can type them in the Q&A section. Crystal Cortez is a sound installation artist and programmer based out of Portland, Oregon. She is also a professor of creative coding and sonic arts at Portland Community College. As someone who never saw herself represented in computer music or creative tech, her work focuses on the empowerment of underserved populations gaining access and knowledge around technology. In 2019, she co-founded Whatever Space, a makerspace offering free and sliding scale workshops and technology rentals with priority going to the Black, Indigenous, and people of color community. Under her performance moniker, Crystal Cortez, she transforms field recordings, uses synthesis, audio programming, data sonification, and 3D sound spatialization to produce complex sonic realms. Ms. Cortez's work has been presented at the International Conference on New Interfaces for Musical Expression, Portland Institute for Contemporary Art, Pacific Northwest College of Art, and more. Tonight, Crystal presents an introduction to sensor-driven sound art and universal interface design through a showcase of her wearable technology instruments that monitor movement and other corporeal methods to liberate the performer from their interfaces. I'm now delighted to introduce to you Crystal Cortez. Crystal, welcome.
Hi, thank you for the introductions. It's great to be here. I wish I could see all your faces, but I know you're here. Thank you for showing up. So as you just said, I'm going to talk about sensor-driven sound art, which is a practice that I do very often. As well as principles of universal design. And I'm going to highlight a project that I did over the last year, 2019 to 2020, where I worked with an organization called the Portland Art and Learning Studio, and I'll talk more about that as we go along. So I'm going to also share a performance with you, but before I do that, I'm going to share a little bit more of my work and about what I do. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully sound works and everything like that. Okay, so first of all, my name is Crystal Cortez. I use she, her, or they, them pronouns. And this is some contact information. I am open to being contacted if after this you have any questions or just want to pick my brain on something. You can email me or contact me on Instagram. Those are both great ways to reach out to me. And as Salvatore said, I am a professor of sonic arts and creative coding at the Portland Community College. We have a really interesting and robust creative coding department there, so we're really lucky. And I teach the Max MSP series there. I also teach the Ableton series, so we use Ableton as our primary DAW for music production. I also teach composition and digital arts and equity. So those are some of the classes that I teach this year. And then I want to highlight a few projects that I have as ongoing projects on my website, which you can also read more in here later. But as Salvatore said, I have a music practice, so I'm a performer as well as a programmer. And most recently, because of quarantine, I've been doing mostly outdoor, social distance, public works. So these outdoor installations where I live score this projection art. So I just wanted to share a minute of that with you. And if someone could let me know in the chat if sound is not working, this will be our first test of that. Okay, so that was just a short clip. So that's a collaboration with a local art collective called the Mobile Projection Unit that does all of these outdoor projection works. So that's what I've been doing in quarantine. There hasn't been many opportunities to perform, but in regular life I'm typically out and performing a couple times a month or touring. Another project I wanted to highlight is the Community Power Pods initiative, which myself and some other local makers started in reaction to the Black Lives Matter protests here in Portland. So these events were primarily outdoors, requiring generators. So we designed this solar-powered portable generator specifically to lend out to Black Lives Matter events and activist events here in Portland. So at this point, this is our first build, but since then we have 3 additional generators that are solar powered that we have been able to lend out for various activist events here in Portland. So there's a strong maker community here. We have a lot of maker spaces, and I'm lucky to be surrounded by a lot of great programmers and hardware makers as well. So I'm not going to talk a lot about this project yet because I will highlight it further in the discussion today. But another thing that I manage at the Portland Community College is our high-density loudspeaker array. So we are one of maybe 5 places in the entire country that have a high-density loudspeaker array, which means that you have 24 or more speakers in a system. So we have a 32 speaker system, and I manage a residency program for students at PCC that every year get to be introduced to how to compose for 32 speakers. We do this primarily through Ableton and Max MSP, and all the spatialization happens in Max MSP. So this is the last showcase that we did. It's at a local art space in Portland called Disjecta Art Center, and I'm just going to play you a little clip of that to give you a sense of what this can do. We put the speakers up in a cube, so it was immersive for people who attended. And the piece that I'm going to show is a generative composition that myself and Francisco Boteo made in Max MSP. And in this piece, we're sonifying climate change data and inviting people to add their voices to the piece. So you'll see from the clip that I show you, people's voices are also being recorded and then moved around the 32 speakers in the space. So I'm going to show you a clip of that. So there's a lot of low frequency content there that doesn't translate great over computer speakers, but you can kind of get the idea of what that was like. Another thing I wanted to highlight is Whatever Space, which is something that is accessible to you all as well. We've transitioned to having all of our workshops be virtual, so we'll have a new set of programming coming out in the next few months, but we teach workshops on Pure Data, Max MSP, microcontrollers, Arduino, all sorts of creative technologies. And we decided to make this space because a lot of us came out of academic institutions that we understand are prohibitive to people. Not everyone can afford to go to school or has time to go to school, so we offer off-hours workshops that are free and sliding scale and prioritize the BIPOC community. So you can find our website here if you're interested. You can always send us an email, and we can get you on our list to let you know when we have workshops coming up that you might want to attend. And then beyond that, I'm going to talk a lot today about wearable technology. So I will leave that to the presentation, but if you're interested, there's a number of other installation pieces with video documentation of that you could check out. Most of the installations I do are all based around interactive technology, so they're focused on the audience becoming the performer. So check those out later if you are interested. Cool, so the next thing I wanted to do was to share a performance with you that I recently recorded. So in this performance I am using a couple pieces of wearable technology that I built. So I built a 360-degree headband rotation sensor, so it detects the rotation of your head. And then I built a program to read that as MIDI, and I built that in Max MSP. And that is triggering different sounds within the piece. There's also another sensor that you'll see in the video that is a sonar sensor. It's a 4-directional sonar sensor that can sense distance of the person from that sensor. And the distance decides which sounds are being played from the program that I wrote as well. So the beginning of this video is a little bit quiet, but it does ramp up after about a minute. So just if you don't hear any sound right away, don't be worried. It'll probably just come in about a minute or so. I do have the code projected in this video, but I'll pull it up afterward and give you a little walkthrough of that. So in this video, it's primarily microcontrollers that I've built, or these wearable interfaces, as well as Max MSP and Ableton. So when I'm at the table playing, I'm primarily working in Ableton. Okay, so let's go ahead and watch this. It's about 15 minutes. Something I do say in the beginning of the video in text form is an invitation for you to get up and move. So my recent practice is surrounded by the idea of movement driving music. So in this video, it's all pretty ambient, experimental music, so I invite you, if you want, to get up and stretch, move your body as much as you want along to this video. Okay, so let me know if sound doesn't work for any reason. Okay, we're back. Um, Thank you for watching that. Um, so yeah, in that video in the beginning, I was using the head rotation sensor headband, which I have the prototype for that right here. It has a 9 degrees of freedom sensor on it, and then I've programmed it so that it sends that data into whatever program I want it to as MIDI. And then this is the 4-directional ultrasonic sensor that I also use in the video. Same thing, I code it so that it translates this data into MIDI, and I can use that data however I want to within the program that I make. And then you also saw the visuals are coded in MaxMSP as well using jitter. And those visuals are audio reactive, so that's all stuff that you can program within MaxMSP. So I'm talking a lot about MaxMSP. I'm not sure if you all are very aware of it or not. But MaxMSP is a visual programming language, and it's a program for software development. So you can create your own music software, software for visuals, software for lights. There's tons of possibilities within MaxMSP. And for those of you, again, who are familiar with Ableton, Ableton is built using MaxMSP. So you might be familiar with Max for Live or something like that. I did want to show you a little bit of the code up close for this piece. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second so that I can open Max and show you a little bit about that. Give me just a second. And hopefully this will work. Zoom and Max together sometimes has a hard time, but hopefully it'll be good to us today. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again here. Okay, so here's that program that I was working with for this piece. Looks like my video is lagging quite a bit, so I'm just going to turn that off while I'm sharing this. But, so I have the ultrasonic sensors coming through here. They are triggering different sounds based on how far away I am from the sensors. They're also triggering lights, which were kind of hidden from that video, but we're changing color based on my distance from the sensors as well. All that light programming is going on here. And then the headband has X, Y, and Z rotation. So let me see if I can show the video again for this. So X is turning my head from left to right, Y is up and down, and Z is kind of this sort of side-to-side action. And that could be programmed to do anything, right? But for me, what made the most sense in the way I like to move my body and to perform, especially for this piece, was to have pitch decided by my left and right turning of my head, and then the amount of effects being applied being tied to my head being up or down, and then the amplitude of that given sound changing based on the z-axis. So that's the decisions I made there. There could be any sort of other parameter mapping that you could decide. This is the video effects section and the sound reactive section here of code. So I don't know if this makes sense to any of you, but I thought maybe it'd be interesting to see a little bit of it. There's a bunch of hidden more code inside of here that just gets pretty intense and messy. But if you're familiar with Max, then you know how that goes. So just wanted to give you a quick view of that. I'm going to reshare my screen now back to the presentation. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how I started making these instruments that I was using in the video. Okay, so I'm going to highlight this project. So in the video that you saw, my motivation behind creating these instruments is to center the body in music production. And I've been asking myself questions like, how does my body like to move intuitively? And what are the ways to translate those body movements into sound that are pleasing to me? And these questions were very much inspired by my work with the Portland Art and Learning Studio over the last year. So at the Portland Art and Learning Studio, myself, I led a group of engineers, including myself, Quinn Jarvis Holland, Francisco Bateo, and Station Gammo. And we collaborated with artists from this organization. And the Portland Art and Learning Studio is a creative studio in Portland for artists with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So we met a group of 5 artists and worked with them one-on-one to develop instruments tailored specifically to the way they move their bodies and develop programs based on the way they learn as well. So our initial meetings were dedicated to brainstorming possible form factors and to observe the challenges that these artists currently faced with non-adaptive instruments. And the team spoke with artists there as well as staff and facilitators who all had a variety of perspectives and ideas about new instrument solutions. So we listened to that, and after the initial brainstorming meetings with the artists, we began to rapid prototype MIDI controllers using various sensors for the clients to play and for the engineers to get a better sense of what kinds of movement and interaction the clients preferred to use. So we created a bunch of instrument prototypes with different types of sensors, then had the artists come back in and test those and play with them and observed and asked them what they liked about it and what they would like to see change, maybe other ways that we didn't think of that they might want to control sound. So we did some initial meetings and tests before deciding on our final round of instruments. So many of the artists that we worked with had limited dexterity, meaning that ordinary MIDI controllers that require you to have a wide range of motion or be able to apply a lot of pressure in your hands simply did not work for them. Similarly, many audio programs require a lot of dexterity to use. So things like Ableton require a lot of dexterity to use on your computer. So, and those programs as well just aren't very intuitive to get to know. And with this in mind, the interfaces we designed for the instruments to control used primarily visual feedback for the programs that we wrote. So we mapped parameter changes to things like color, for example, to make them more intuitive, to understand, and easier to learn. So for this, we used creative coding languages, frameworks, and environments as opportunities to expand access for historically excluded communities to computer programming. So this was, again, a collaborative project, and we demonstrated how programmer demographics, including artists with disabilities, impacts programming design. So the capabilities of open source and creative coding languages can engage a more diverse range of developers in design and the construction of new tools as well as end users. So they have a low barrier to entry to allow for problem solving for intersectional and minority communities like those with the disabilities at the Portland Art and Learning Studio. And then they're more financially and logistically feasible. So the programs that we work with, like Max MSP, there's a free version called Pure Data. There's also Arduino, which is what we use to code the sensors, which is free as well. So this gives anyone an opportunity to kind of dive into this type of work. So working together with the Portland Art and Learning Studio, we applied creative coding to develop an ensemble of accessible musical instruments that facilitated collaborative music making for all people involved. So that's another thing that we learned from this group of artists, is that they preferred to perform as a group rather than individually. So that also influenced how we wrote programs and how we decided to make certain choices, like keeping instruments in key or having the group being able to decide on a certain key for the entire program or for the entire set of instruments. So one thing I also want to highlight is that the public has access to the code that we made and the design plan. So we have an open source mindset when it comes to this work. We want to encourage teams elsewhere to use and modify these instruments and develop custom solutions for their own communities. So you can find our code on GitHub here. So it's got the Maximus P code and the Arduino code here. You can also find out a little bit more about the instruments that we ended up designing. So as I said, there's a lot of issues around dexterity, so we used a lot of touch capacitive sensors in a lot of these instruments. And then what this doesn't show in this site is the program design, so what the user interface looks like on the computer. But those were, again, mapped to a lot of visual feedback. So we have this interactive drum sequencer that is has these 4 pressure sensors as well as a pressure slider. So you can, no matter how hard you touch this, you can play it. So some artists like to kind of slam on the pads, others like to very gently touch it, and regardless of the pressure you apply, this will translate that information. Again, this is where I first built the headband synth as well. And we have another 9 degrees of freedom controller that was handheld so that people could control parameters of the music just by rotating their wrists and holding this. The other tool that we used was the Kinect, the Xbox Kinect, and its camera so that people could use their entire bodies to play an instrument if they wanted to. This also has, it can sense depth as well, so you could move forward and backward from the Kinect and play music that way. So this work was shown at the International Conference on New Interfaces for Musical Expression. That's where this poster is from. And I wanted to highlight some of the principles that we had in mind when we were developing these instruments. So I'm going to talk a little bit about universal design as well as the social model for disability and critical disability theory. So the next section that I'm going to go through has information pulled from various academic journals. I list them all at the end, so if anyone's interested, you're all students, I presume, so you probably have access to JSTOR. You could read any of those if you're interested. I also pull information from the Computer Music Journal, which I highly recommend checking out. You can also find that on JSTOR. It has tons of interesting articles about music and sound and computer programming. And you can find backlogs of that there as well. And then I also pull from the paper that we wrote for the NEAM conference as well about our project. So in talking about the principles behind this project, the first kind of framework that we looked at was the social model of disability. So this was developed in 1975 by the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation. One of its main tenets is that disability is a social construct. It diverges from the medical model of disability. So while physical, sensory, intellectual, or psychological variation may cause individual functional limitation, these do not necessarily have to lead to disability. Another tenet is that disability is caused by society, failing to take account of and include people regardless of their individual differences. And it looks at disability as impairment versus disability, so it looks at that distinction. And the social model of disability presents the individual as needing access to support and assistance in the same way as any other person. So for example, in a lecture hall, chairs are provided to the audience to sit, right? These are not considered aids or special devices. They are normalized as a part of the expectation that people would become tired if they had to stand up for any length of time. So chairs are provided for the comfort and assistance of the audience in a completely unremarkable way. So yet if someone needs special access to a room or venue, this can sometimes be presented as a difficulty and problematized. So the principles of inclusive design recommend that it is not only people who walk into a venue who should be considered, but all members of society. So this includes wheelchair users or parents with prams or buggies as well. And then I wanted to highlight a relevant discussion in the Music Educators Journal. And what they say is musical instruments musical instrument designs sometimes turn impairments into disabilities. A person might be very musical and enjoy the violin, saxophone, or piano, but if the individual does not have the use of both arms, he or she is unable to play these instruments. And like buildings, instruments are created by human artisans. So from a social model perspective, because these instruments are not designed with a person with an impairment in mind, they prevent some individuals from making music with them, even though their impairments do not inhibit them from enjoying music. So these are some excellent points applying the social model of disability. However, this example doesn't encompass the variety of experiences and impairments that are faced by people with intellectual disabilities, particularly those experiencing those intellectual disabilities exclusively. So this is very much in line with the prevalence of meritocracy and a marked penchant for valuing skill or virtuoso above self-expression. So intellectual disabilities do not inhibit people who experience them from enjoying music or desiring to play music. Aspects that may be inhibiting are having a vast number of controls requiring precision, rhythmic timing, reading quickly, or having too many pitches to choose from. Coincidentally, these are also aspects of an instrument's design that inhibit non-musicians, children, and the elderly. In turn, building interfaces with the intent of avoiding impairments can serve multiple populations. So looking at time, I'm going to quickly move through the other frameworks that we looked at. So critical disability theory. Critical disability theory is rooted in a critique of traditional discourse and assumptions of disability, which serve to oppress persons with disabilities and infringe on their human rights. The theory is built upon the argument that disability is not fundamentally a question of medicine or health, nor is it just an issue of sensitivity and compassion. Rather, it's a question of politics and power, power over and power to. This perspective challenges able-bodied supremacy and the oppression that arises from restricting economic and social benefits to persons with disabilities, which are then redistributed as privileges to be negotiated. So critical disability theory moves away from the individual pathology of disability based on the biomedical model and beyond liberalism and a social model of disability. And then finally, universal design. So universal design is the design and composition of an environment so that it can be accessed, understood, and used to the greatest extent possible by all people, regardless of their age, size, ability, or disability. It is designing for all users rather than the typical or quote-unquote average user. So it says that a resource should be designed to meet the needs of all people who wish to use it. This should not be an additional requirement set up just for the benefit of only a minority of the population with special needs. It is a fundamental condition of good design. So if an environment is accessible, usable, convenient, and a pleasure to use, everyone benefits. Universal design is not about accommodation, it is about good design that works for everyone. So while universal design has been common in the physical world for many years, attention to universal design in the digital realm is still fairly new. So just as buildings that have ramps and elevators are accessible to wheelchair users, digital products that adhere to accessible design principles are usable by people with a wide range of abilities. The approach allows each user to interact with the technology in the way that works best for them. So these were the principles that my collaborators and I took into account when we worked with the Portland Art and Learning Studio, and inspired me to look back at those controllers in my own music practice and ask these questions. Do these instruments really work for me? Do they work for how I like to use my body, or how I learn, or how I create? And the answer was no in a lot of cases. And implementing these instruments into my own practice has begun a series of inquiry for myself on what music could be like if it starts from a place of movement. So those are some things that I've been thinking about. Another thing that I wanted to highlight was some other work in Portland along these lines at CymaSpace. As well, here's the reference section. I can get anyone a link to this slideshow if you're interested. So this has articles on all of these principles as well as links to some of the software that I went over. But CymaSpace. So CymaSpace is a really interesting local makerspace. So they make arts, cultural, and media events accessible and inclusive specifically to the deaf and hard of hearing through technology, education, and outreach. And a lot of their engineers are also deaf as well. So this is just a short little video. I want to highlight if anyone is interested in checking out CymaSpace. This is another great set of Portland artists and engineers. Okay, so definitely check out CymaSpace. They, when quarantine was not going on, would set up at a lot of local music shows to make them accessible to the deaf community. So that's kind of what I wanted to cover today, just give you an introduction to some of this interface work, as well as the universal design principles behind it, and then some of the other work that I've been doing. I'm happy to answer some questions regarding any aspect of my work or anything else you can think of. And I think we have a little bit of time set aside for that.
Yes, so if anyone has any questions, if you're comfortable speaking, you can raise your hand. I'd be happy to turn on your mic. Or feel free at the bottom, there's a Q&A section. Feel free to type in any questions that you may have there, and I'd be happy to relate them to Crystal. Let me check right now. Well, one question we have is, can you talk, maybe speak a little bit more about Whatever Space?
Yeah, so Whatever Space, there's 5 core members. We all graduated from the same creative coding program and then started doing a bunch of interactive installations around town. We were all embedded in kind of the DIY music and art scenes in Portland, so we realized a lot of our friends wanted to learn these skills but couldn't go to college to do it. So we started to make these bite-sized workshops that introduce music and creative coding software as well as hardware workshops. So we've done workshops on how to make microcontrollers and contact mics, as well as a lot of the software workshops. We've also done workshops on things like live streaming as well. So anything tech and creative, we're interested in doing workshops on. So in the coming year, we're planning on starting workshops up again about May. And if you have more specific questions, let me know. I'm happy to talk more about that.
Okay. And another question, what is your compositional process? So at what point did you begin to merge music and technology, or were they always conjoined in your practice?
They definitely, I mean, coding wasn't always employed in my music practice. That wasn't until a few years ago when I started learning coding and Max MSP specifically that kind of changed everything for me. I fell in love with Max because you can create any sound program that you can dream of that works in the way that your brain works. So that was really exciting to me. So I use Max for certain things and I use Ableton for others. I do a lot of sound processing in Max MSP, so a lot of the sound design of my sounds happens in Max, and a lot of the actual composition happens in Ableton. So my work and the palettes that I create are almost exclusively based on field recording. I've had many years of practice as a field recordist um, out in nature and then also for film as well. So that was kind of a natural progression for me, was to go from synthesizers and hardware into creating my own palettes starting from field recording as the base. And then compositionally, the process is usually highly conceptual. I usually have to start with a concept and build works around that.
And I'm just going to build on that. Couple things. One, can you kind of talk about maybe the learning curve for someone, because Max it's visual based, so it's not. I think it's more accessible because it's not hard coding for someone who maybe has no experience. But what kind of learning? Say someone who has spent a couple of years comfortable in Ableton or whatever DAW that may be, but to make that leap then over to have more customizations possible with Max, like what kind of learning curve would you find that for the typical DAW user and how accessible it is for them?
Yeah, there definitely is a learning curve. I went to school and learned this in a classroom setting, which I think was necessary for me. Now there is a lot of great YouTubers, YouTube series that cover Max MSP instruction that you can access for free, obviously. But I think some type of instruction is necessary. For someone like me, I never thought I would get into coding. I was learning C++, which is what the type of like text-based coding that you do for Arduino and coding those controllers at the same time as Max MSP, which is completely different. It's like what I showed you in that screen. You're connecting these objects together and creating a signal flow, essentially. And that was much more intuitive to me. I had used Ableton before, and if you're familiar with Ableton, visually at least, a lot of things are going to look similar. You're going to be used to seeing the same sorts of dials and sliders and integer boxes and things like that that you see in Ableton. So at least visually there's some connection there. But I think that I would encourage anyone to check out Max MSP. Pure Data, the free version, has a little bit less of an advanced user interface, and that can be hard to get into. For me, it was. Um, so I would recommend getting the trial of Max MSP. I can definitely send you some recommendations for content to watch as a beginner. The other thing that Max has that's really amazing is it has this whole series of tutorials for getting started with Max. So there's all this written language about how to make a certain program. You follow that, and they also give you the example program, so you can kind of try to do it yourself, but then also look at the finished example and A/B those two things. So I would also really recommend the tutorials that come with Max. Was there another question that I didn't answer that you said?
I have one. I forgot to turn my mic on. Here's another question. How young were you when you discovered your art, and how long does it take to create these projects?
Yeah, I have been making experimental music, performance art installations since I was about 21. I mean, I was making music before that, but I wasn't really out in the world doing it, performing. It taking it seriously until I was around 21. And so it's been almost 10 years of that work, and I just keep collecting more tools as I go along, realizing that I do really love technology. I really love being able to take things into my own hands. What was the second half of that question?
About how long does it take, basically from start to finish, to create your projects?
Yeah, so that's really depends. I think, things that involve these types of sensors take a really long time. There's a huge like research and development stage where you're learning how the sensor works, you're deciding how you want to code it, what kinds of thresholds you want on it, and then you have to build the program to read that in and decide what you want that data to do. So I would say that making an instrument like this would take me um, about a month, probably, just playing around and deciding how I want it to function and fixing any bugs that are within it. I definitely have gotten faster over time. With programming, I would say when I first started making things like this, it would take me more like 3 months to do something like that. So it's streamlined a bit now. As far as the music production, that is more inhibited by my own mind than anything. If I have a strong idea and creativity is flowing, then a song can, I think a lot of you probably have experienced this. A song can happen in like 3 minutes, or it can happen in 4 weeks. But I have really dialed in my technology practice. So I return to a lot of the same tools unless I'm building a new one for that project. But I kind of have a lot of my technology decided. I think it's really important to limit yourself in certain ways. So decide your palette of tools that you're going to work with when you start a project or start composing. And then maybe you can expand if that's not working. But I try to impose limitations so that the process doesn't take forever. Because, when is art finished? I don't
Right.
know.
I have another question from a student. I have an Xbox at home and Ableton Live. Can you use the Connect to make music with Ableton Live?
That's a good question. Yes, you could. So if you fed the Connect into a program like Arduino, and then this, I don't know if this is all new terminology for you, but you can send data from one program to another via OSC. So this is a way that you communicate between programs any data that you want to. So there's ways that you can get that data into Ableton and use it to control things, definitely.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, I guess we'll just close with, I guess with these instruments that we went over today, like what do you foresee the future, or what would be an ideal future of the music classroom in a much more inclusive environment, using, maybe not those specific instruments, but something of that sort, that would allow music to be accessible to everybody. But also, as you say, following the principles of universal design, where it works for everyone and they're enjoyable for all, and they can make music regardless of ability or musical background for that matter.
Yeah, I really like the model kind of that we have going at PCC, where we have a creative coding department, we have a sonic arts department. So I would love to see students have a lab of sensors, know some basics about putting microcontrollers together, or at least about sensors, to understand what the possibilities are for ways that they might want to interact with music. And the more people that I'm really just passionate about people learning how to code as well, because it's really empowering. So in an ideal world, I would love for everyone to be able to make instruments that are specifically suited for them. And I think this type of thing is not you try to apply universal design principles, but I think the user interaction is so important to the development of these things. So being able to ask a human being, is this working for you? Is this not working for you? That's the type of interaction that we have at PCC right now, because we can have sonic arts students using the technology that the creative coding students make, and then there can be that dialogue back and forth of whether those things are working for them or not. So I would love to see that happening on, not even an academic institution level, but in places that are more accessible to the public, kind of like whatever space and other accessible maker spaces. These instruments themselves, I'm going to continue to advance them, kind of rein them in. The actual design of the enclosure obviously is not in a strong stage, so that's something that I'm trying to work on, is enclosure design, so I feel comfortable handing these off to people and them being durable, right? So that's also a cost issue. But the cool thing is that you can make controllers pretty cheaply if you're not too worried about how they look. Something like this probably is like $20 total, you know.
And we have one more question, I think. Oh, has your music programs ever been used in combination with meditation or other purposes like that?
Yeah, I have. I mean, in the installation work that I do, there's always kind of spaces for intentional reflection. So we'll create these kind of environments, and then the sound is pumping through the space as kind of a guide toward a meditative state. I've also done sound baths, things like that. So explicitly in those ways, I've heard feedback from people that they use it in that way sometimes too. But yeah, I do have this goal behind my music of creating a space for introspection. It's why I really like marrying the field recordings, so the natural sounds in our environment, with all this technology to kind of generate a fuller picture of the world that we actually exist in, to allow us to go inward, if that makes sense.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Any other questions before we depart for the evening? Have you considered 3D printing to make any enclosures?
I have 3D printed some enclosures in the past. I also have a bunch of sculptural interfaces that I was using for a while, which I laser cut enclosures for, as well as 3D printed enclosures for them. In the last year, the lab that I had access to is closed due to quarantine, so I just haven't had access to those tools in a while. But those are great solutions, definitely laser cutting and 3D printing. And I think most cities have maker spaces with those tools that you can access.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Crystal, for joining us this evening. I'm just going to say a couple thank you to people. So I would like to thank President Mary Moore, Vice President Dr. Susan Campos, the Dean of Arts and Sciences, Kevin Lee, Associate Dean Rick Segovia, and our VPC Department Chairperson, Dennis McNamara, for their continued support in implementing this virtual series. Thank you all for attending. Our next event is March 10th, and it's the MKD Trio. It's a flute, violin, and cellist. And just so you all know, at Triton, we continue to offer electronic music production courses and record production courses. They do not have any prerequisites. They are open to all. So if you're interested, feel free to contact me or contact Triton Admissions. We offer them every semester. Crystal, thanks again. It was a pleasure having you. Thank you for sharing with us. And everyone, have a good night.
Thank you, everyone. Again, feel free to reach out.